Cloud spending is expected to hit $1.35 trillion by 2027, but 30% of it will go to waste without better FinOps practices. My name is Paul Nashawaty, and I'm the practice lead for the AppDev practice at theCUBE Research. And today we're talking about bridging FinOps, CloudOps, and the future of cloud governance. I'm joined by Tatum. Tatum, welcome.
Hey, Paul, thanks for having me. I'm doing well. So as you said, my name is Tatum Tummins, currently a senior product manager at Kion, which is a tool in the FinOps CloudOps space. But prior to coming to Kion, was a FinOps practitioner for 7-8 years at a large healthcare company, kind of came up with FinOps before it was even a term, right? I remember when I started out, I didn't even know what to really call my job, right? And then 2019, 2020, FinOps Foundation comes along and I realized this is what I'm doing. And so, yeah, I kind of grew up with kind of the practice and came to Kion on the vendor side because I was a tool user myself. I knew what I liked, what I didn't like, where I felt like the industry was still missing a few key critical features. And so, yeah, wanted to come to the vendor side and try to bring what I liked and didn't like to other users. So
That's amazing, because that's really the best of both worlds, right? To like actually see how it's working and then actually doing something about it to help others achieve their goals. And what we see and in the research in the market today is that FinOps Foundation report says that 22% of organizations say they have fully integrated FinOps in their cloud management practice. Only 22%. So there's a lot of room for growth there. We also see that automation of cloud cost governance sees a 25% reduction in waste and 40% faster cloud adoption cycles. So that's a big factor that organizations are looking at, but again, not fully adopted. And we see also from a research perspective that 73% of IT leaders struggle with aligning their cloud budgets and their business priorities. So, Tatum, when we look at FinOps and CloudOps, why is it top of mind for enterprises today?
yeah, well, it's no secret, right? Cloud spend. There's lots of arguments over like was cloud the right bet, right? There for last decade, organizations were adopting the cloud, and I think some under the promise that it was going to be cheaper. And I think where we've kind of fallen short is that we're thinking about it in terms of just, is it cheaper or is it not cheaper? And we're not necessarily thinking about value. And ultimately, that's what FinOps is. That's the definition of FinOps, right? Is trying to maximize business value. And so there's parts of managing your cloud when it comes to, getting products developed faster, being able to be more adaptable, things of that nature that all make up value alongside, the dollars and cents. And as organizations have scaled, right, we've gotten larger and larger in the cloud. You quoted at the beginning, right, however many trillion we're going to be in here in just a handful of years. That number gets bigger. The complexity gets more complex because you've now got multi-cloud for a lot of organizations. And to manage all of that effectively requires new processes, things that we haven't done for decades and decades. So some of it's net new, some of it's refining some things we've been doing over the last year. And so kind of my point of view into this is that I'm a really big proponent of automation and what that's going to mean to organizations, because I think we're now out of the world where we can rely on, more manual processes to scale and govern and cut down on cost. And we're going to have to actually lean into proactive automation to successfully manage and have kind of the cloud infrastructure we expect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But, when I think about different levels of maturity and how organizations are, even just instituting, how to maximize their business value through these cloud cost optimization and collaboration, they need to inform, optimize, and look at an operational framework. But I think the thing that we should talk about here is, what is FinOps? And from the perspective, let's take it really back to the basics and discuss what is FinOps, what is CloudOps, and why is FinOps and CloudOps, important to work together?
Yeah, so we'll start with high level FinOps. I kind of alluded to it at the beginning, but FinOps is a cultural practice that through collaboration, you're maximizing the value of your cloud. That's kind of the high level definition. If you want to break it down just a little bit further, there are three major phases that an organization continuously goes through. It's the inform, optimize, and operate phase. To kind of give a quick definition of those. So the inform phase, this is where organizations are getting a handle and visibility into what their spend is, right? Who's spending what, kind of getting a single pane of glass of that spend and allocating it out to the right budgets, cost centers, things of that nature. Then you move into the optimize phase. And this is where you're more traditional trying to save money, right? Whether it's cutting down on the rates you might pay with the cloud service providers, or it's trying to figure out, strategies for commitment discounts to reduce, the cost of compute, things of that nature. So that's the optimize phase. And then the last phase is that operate piece. And this is where I have a personal bias, but I think it's often overlooked or misunderstood what's expected here. And it'll tie into the cloud ops piece. But operate is where you're coming up with those long-term sustainable processes for how you're going to mature your practice over time, and coming up with what I like to say that's where the governance really comes in, and that's where I think cloud ops comes in. And so I'll pause here and just say, cloud ops means something different at every organization. Some people call it DevOps, some people call it just cloud engineering, architecture, whatever it might be. But there are people at every organization who care about efficiency, automation, security and access, those types of things that are required when managing your cloud infrastructure. And those folks, I think, are uniquely suited to help FinOps teams really, really drive strong governance practices that live in that operate phase I was just talking about.
Yeah, and it does make sense because when you think about the variable cost spikes and the reactive problem solvings that organizations have, they often push this challenge or problem back into the DevOps teams or the cloud ops teams, right? And a lot of times how this happens from a maturity perspective is there's a modernization approach where organizations like, hey, we need to modernize, we need to go, right? And unfortunately, what they do is they kind of do this without any cost measurements in place. They kind of say, okay, we need to move forward. We need to kind of just get this going because there's pressures on the organization to modernize their applications, in the next 6 to 18 months or whatever it may be. But what ends up happening is after they modernize, after they're going through the process, they realize that this cost spike occurs. And it's a big challenge because they're over budget, they've over provisioned, and then there's this, well, okay, there's not a good factor here of saying this isn't sustainable. So when we look at that, the cloud ops team then get additional pressures on them, right? And the additional pressures for the DevOps teams, the cloud ops teams, is they have to look at cloud infrastructure for efficiency, security, and automation, right? And look at it from the context of how is this going to be better when they move forward with this modernization effort. Because if you're spending all this time and money to modernize and you're not getting better performance or you're not getting better results, or if it's costing too much, you're outside the business KPIs, right? So I think when we look at it from that perspective, what are your thoughts around how cloud ops and FinOps work together to make that, the kind of harmonization around that modernization effort?
Yeah, so you talking about modernization is really interesting because that's kind of at the beginning when I was talking about we just think about value as being cost, right? Are we saving money or are we not? Part of the reason you modernize is you might spend an extra dollar, but if that application is more scalable, it is better performing for your customers or end users, right? And that ultimately leads to more revenue, right? That's part of the reason you modernize. And so having folks, more technical folks, often your cloud ops teams that I'm referring to, having the ability to explain that, right, back to the business or prove it, right, from a metric standpoint, that is a huge part of showing the value of the cloud, while your traditional, FinOps teams are trying to figure out how you make things cheaper, right? That collaboration point of we have a better performing, scalable application that's going to allow us to innovate is the technical side, while trying to have other folks who are also focused in collaborating, having the same conversations on how can we also make this a little bit cheaper, a little bit more effective from a budget standpoint as well. Both of those conversations have to happen at the same time. And often two different teams are best suited to do that, right? And so, I'll kick it back to you on that.
Yeah, I agree because I see in our research the convergence of business KPIs aligning towards results. It's not about pushing the big green button and getting the application out the door, right, in the CI/CD pipeline. It's more about, okay, well, what is the impact, the business impact, and why does it matter, right? So when we start looking at the cost of cloud mismanagement, right, we see that companies can lose millions of dollars due to cloud waste and lack of productivity for governments, right? This is a big problem that we see with as applications are being created. And as we see in our research, we see that the adoption of applications by citizen developers are growing very rapidly, right? We're seeing that organizations want to release code very rapidly. In fact, we see that 24% of respondents indicate that they want to release code on an hourly basis, yet only 8% are able to do so. But this growth of applications and scale needs to have governance, needs to have those kind of guardrails and bumpers in place. And I think that's something that we should talk a little bit more about here, which is the business impact. Because if we understand the technical piece and the deployment, what does it mean if you're not doing this?
Yeah, I think that as we'll just say, as a FinOps community of folks who really care about this, we got too comfortable with the reactive optimization, right? We almost accepted that waste is going to exist, and so let's come up with tools that identify waste. Let's work with teams to try to, go back and delete that waste or optimize usage. And that's where I see the mindset shift coming, is folks taking that time that they used to invest in that reactive optimization phase and taking that same, hour, 2 hours, whatever it may be, and investing that up front in proactive optimization and coming up with, okay, is this a dev or sandbox account? Can we put in any proactive guardrails for what we expect or want our usage to look like in this? That could be certain types of compute that you're going to allow. It could be, hey, this is a dev instance, we're going to turn it off automatically on weekends and nights, and putting that in at the beginning of the life cycle of that account versus coming back and realizing 3 months, 6 months later, oh, we've got waste in this account. Let's do something about it now. I think we're going to see more and more companies try to figure out how can we prevent that waste from ever existing with automation and good process. And that's going to be kind of the future of FinOps in my mind.
Yeah, and I agree that we're moving away from these quote bedtime scripts or nighttime scripts and moving towards that automation and governance by default, right? We're seeing that as the factor. We're also seeing that some of these preemptive financial policies are stopping 50K in cloud spikes before they even happen, right? That's a big factor to consider from a financial impact. But it's not just the FinOps is not just about reducing those cloud bills. It's also about that sustainable cloud adoption, right? Would you agree with that?
I would. And I actually, you talk about that spike, and I want to give an example of how they tie together, right? So real example from my prior life, back when I was a practitioner, we had, just like a lot of companies today, AI was taking off. We had this idea for how we're going to implement that in one of our applications. And so we had this business initiative kick off where we're like, hey, let's do some testing on what the impact could be on one of our applications. We go through the normal process, right? You stand up an account, you try to give people access to it. For us, that unfortunately took days, sometimes weeks, to actually get developers access to an account. So there's your first scalability problem of, if you can't get an account for weeks, right, you now have people who can't do work to ultimately generate new revenue for the company. You have that problem. But then once development actually starts, right, I come to work on a Monday morning and I see this large spike in our dashboards, and I don't know who spun it up because there's no tagging on it. And I don't know if it's waste. I assume it is. And so I have to now go on a 48-hour kind of Easter egg hunt trying to figure out who spun this up. Is it waste? Can we delete it? And all of that can be avoided. Both the how do we scale and get to the cloud faster with better account provisioning, better access management, but also how do we have the policies in place that prevent that untagged instance, that prevent that spike from potentially ever existing. And so it's totally a scalability and a cost conversation at the same time.
Yeah, there's definitely, I see in our research as well that this is where a lot of organizations typically go wrong, right? What they end up doing is they end up having the FinOps function as part of the procurement team or the finance driven function. And it really is all about the numbers, right? They look at it and they go, okay, these are the numbers. But conversely, you have the DevOps teams that are trying to do their jobs, right? They're trying to get this stuff done. And they typically, I don't know, not to speak poorly of my DevOps friends out there, but like they will over provision because they need to get it done and they don't have any budget guardrails in place, right? And because of that, companies are looking at remediating the cloud costs instead of preventing that waste up front. And that becomes kind of one of the challenges I was talking about up front in the beginning of the conversation. When you start these projects, knowing ahead of time what you're doing and kind of putting those guardrails in place will allow for your cloud ops or DevOps teams to provision appropriately, knowing that they have this budget to work with. Is that really what you're kind of getting to?
Yeah, the earlier the conversation starts, the better, right? You talk about, you hear the idea of shifting left all the time, and shift left applies to product development. It applies to FinOps and CloudOps as well. Like the earlier that you get that person who's responsible for the budget or the forecast, whatever it may be, or responsible for overseeing a project like you're talking about, maybe it's a migration from on-prem to the cloud, talking to the technical folks where they understand their use cases as well. Maybe you're right. Maybe they have to do an initial over provisioning just to make sure, certain parts of the migration work. But when you are having that conversation and your FinOps team and your finance team understands maybe that's a part of that first month of migration, and having those folks who are now accountable and helping the DevOps team be more accountable to go back and evaluate. Let's look at metrics. Let's look at usage. Let's look at storage and memory and those things. And let's now reevaluate, right? At certain life cycle, at certain milestones, right? If I'm a FinOps person and I don't, let's say this is my first migration, and I don't know that that's typical for a DevOps team to maybe over provision just to kind of get over that initial hurdle, right? And I wasn't a part of that conversation. I now don't know any better, right? To try to hold anybody accountable or to try to go in and right size and try to do that. But if I'm part of those conversations from day one, when the technical implementation is being discussed, I now am more armed and equipped to work and collaborate with my counterparts and make better business decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is one of those things where if you don't know, the devils are in the details, right? And if you don't know about this and you're relying on, say, your technical team to say this is what we need, they're not doing anything, wrong. They're trying to do their jobs, and they don't want to be have barriers in place. So knowing what those guardrails are ahead of time really helps. I think, Tatum, I want to switch over to talking about best practices and solutions around this, right? And when we look at shifting from reactive to proactive governance, there's things that organizations certainly can do, right? They can put enforced spending limits. We were just talking about that. Tagging and automation and compliance policies can be put in place, but they can also take advantage, even regardless where they are in their automation or their maturity, they can put automation from the start, right? And they can use automation to kind of help establish those guardrails, and then that will help things move along quickly, but also have the DevOps teams being able to react as needed. So let's talk a little bit about how companies growing from, say 10 million to 200 millions in cloud spends, how they can reduce their provisioning time by 10x. Like those are some of those real life examples that we're seeing, right?
Yeah, yeah. So let me start actually and give kind of a rundown of what I see on the guardrail side, and then we'll talk about provisioning if that's okay. So on the guardrail side, you talk about different levels of maturity, and that's totally accurate. We see customers who are very mature, and their level of automation even bleeds into like production applications. And then we have customers and people I see just in the industry who are starting that maturity journey with automation, and that can start to just look like, hey, we're going to have scripts that run to make sure every instance that's spun up has a certain tagging policy put in, so the key values that we expect. And then that matures into, hey, we have an unattached EBS volume. Let's go ahead and define, if that's 7 days, 14 days. And once that exists, right, we'll go ahead and delete that EBS volume. That's kind of your first phase. And then you kind of gradually go into the more, well, can we actually put in guardrails around like what we expect utilization to be like, right? So think of like some auto scaling policies, or maybe it's some S3 lifecycle management, right? After 6 months, we want to take this from hot storage to cold storage. Those are kind of like the maturity that we see folks go through. On the provisioning side, part of what makes provisioning an account sometimes a challenge for organizations is you've got the access part, right? So we need to spin up an account. Well, who needs access, and what should those roles be able to do on this account? And then you've got kind of your account baselines, right? So I use a simple one, right? We don't want an S3 bucket to be able to have access or a public IP address, right? There's lots of other, depending on the organization, lots of very detailed and complex kind of compliance baselines. And sometimes it's difficult and takes time for those accounts to go through all those reviews and all the access reviews to actually get provisioned. And I think we're going to see more and more folks figure out automation, right? Whether through it's a tool like Kion or other tools in the market or a homegrown solution, building an automation that says, this is the type of account, These are the type of roles and users we expect. And here are the baselines that we kind of have jump starts, right? Out of the box. This is the purpose of this account. So here's all the compliance policies that we need on this type of account, and having those pre-configured so you can automate, right? And have an account ready to go within minutes to start development instead of waiting sometimes weeks to get things into the hands of the developers.
Yeah, again, that's really where you have these frameworks in place in order to get the proper guidance to the DevOps teams, to the CloudOps teams, in order to get the job done. And you have the way to kind of focus on what the business compliance should look like as well. That, when we look at this practical framework, I see it as there's four major kind of sections to it, right? There's visibility, there's guardrails. You mentioned automation, and I think that's important. But then there's also long-term benefits such as scalability, security, and efficiency. Let's double click down on this framework real quick, because I think that is a fundamental starting point for a lot of the audience to think about when they look at the practical implementation of FinOps and what it means from a CloudOps perspective.
Yeah, I'll double click specifically on two of those at least. So talk about efficiency, right? Go back to that word value, and let's say that you're a company that's in a cutting edge industry where staying ahead of the market by 1 to 2 months or even weeks, right, is really important. And the ability to say, hey, we have an idea that we want to test, or we will have a new application that we want to start development on, and being able to do that day of versus having to wait potential weeks and being behind on your development cycle makes a huge long-term ROI benefit, right? Being faster to market than your competitors, things of that nature. So the more efficient your processes are, the quicker the time to value. And on the security side, I'm still a FinOps guy, true and true at my heart. And so when I think about security, I still think about security impacts and how that actually translates to cost. And I'll give you kind of a simple example of where I've had a conversation with folks before on how security ultimately is a FinOps issue. This is a real story. We one time had to rush out the provisioning of an account. It's kind of another high priority strategic issue for our organization. And we copied over some role access that we'd used on another account. What we did not realize is it actually inherited admin abilities to be able to purchase savings plans in an AWS account. And a few months later, we actually had an engineer who, for lack of a better word, made a mistake and purchased a savings plan, a very expensive savings plan in this account, right? And so very quickly, by not managing our access properly and not having like that security identity perspective as being part of kind of a one tool where we can view and manage all of that in one place, we now, a security access problem became a FinOps headache, right, for me to deal with in a prior life. And so there's that example. There's also just examples of more compliance policies being violated, where now someone has to spend their day going through and remediating things manually, trying to figure out how to prevent those things when you could automate that, right? And you save someone an hour, perhaps multiple hours of their day going to remediate a kind of a one-off finding. And so that all ties into just efficiency, allowing people more time to go add value with their day jobs and not spend time doing manual one-off tasks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more when it comes to the security element as it overlays into, the CI/CD pipeline. It all does matter, and I think that the example you just showed about having, kind of an open budget to buy can also cause a lot of changes or challenges. Let's shift a little bit here, and as we kind of come to the end of our session here, I want to talk about the future trends. I know that we did say that the FinOps is maturing in its practice, but can you talk a little bit? Where do you see the evolution of FinOps, how it's moving beyond just like the spending tracking and also proactive cloud financial governance, but also we talked a little bit about automation. How is AI and automation changing cloud cost management in the future? What do you think?
Well, I think so. First off, there's kind of two sides to AI, right? There's FinOps for AI and AI for FinOps, right? And the distinction is there is how do you come up with FinOps processes to help manage the rise of AI infrastructure and AI spend that we're going to see, and then there's AI for FinOps, which is more so how do you actually bring these learning models, right, to FinOps tools to better manage overall spend. I'll spend more time talking about on the former, which is how do you actually manage companies that are really starting to not only experiment, but actually develop applications with generative AI. And so the way that you do that is a little bit different, right? Perhaps than the normal cloud infrastructure, right? You actually need these automation guardrails to, especially in your early days when you're still just in the development cycle, to prevent these cost spikes, right? That might not be necessary. And so putting in limitations on these are the GPU sizes that we're going to allow for testing, putting in some of that more automated, not even just nighttime scripts, but more specific than that, of if our usage hits a certain threshold, we actually want to pause, reevaluate, and go through an iterative cycle. We're going to see more and more companies invest in that heavy proactive automation to govern that spend in order to kind of transform their business safely.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if I look at it from a predictions perspective, I have to talk about it as an analyst. I have to talk about like where the future is going with this, and where we see how enterprises should be prioritizing in 2025. Embedding FinOps into cloud ops and DevOps is part of the unified approach for governance is going to be key, right? It's going to be key as it's driving forward. And organizations will be moving from multi-tool chaos to really more of an integrated governance process in the future. I'm seeing this across the board. I see it in our research that we see that 75% of respondents in our recent study indicate they're using 6 to 15 different tools to gather this information, and then they're processing, but they want it to be in favor of using a unified platform in order to do this. So I think that convergence of that unified platform and governance approach is really going to be a priority in 2025. But Tatum, as we kind of come to the end here, there's a lot here that we talked about, right? And there's a lot of information. I know this is just a short presentation of how organizations could take advantage of this. Where do you think organizations could go to learn more about, cloud ops, DevOps, and FinOps, and what it means to measure success beyond cost savings?
Yeah, so I think you could start with, for folks that may not be as familiar with kind of FinOps broadly, right? So there's the FinOps Foundation, and what they've done a really good job of over the last couple of years is evolving that content to lean in more into how should a traditional FinOps team collaborate, right? What are the roles of every kind of persona within the organization, whether that's your procurement or that's more of your technical folks, your engineering, your security, where is that overlap and how should they rely on each other? I think that's like a critical resource to start with, get familiar with, what is FinOps' ultimate goal and how does everybody play a role into that? And so I always tell like our customers or people that I meet to just get familiar, right, with that content, because whether it's blogs, real case studies, there's kind of an endless amount of content there that I would push people to. And then the second is there's lots of conversations like you and I are starting to have, or folks are starting to share, hey, here's a real use case of how I brought automation to my organization. And so one of the things that I actually have done, so I was fortunate enough to give a reInvent talk about kind of what we're talking about today, how the future of FinOps is CloudOps. And one of the things that I did post reInvent is actually go through and and watch some of those videos for where these DevOps folks are talking about how they brought automation into their organization and what that looks like for them. And so any sort of like kind of publication around giving some sort of instructional case study of real use cases that folks have brought to their organization, I find incredibly valuable, as it gives me ideas of what's even possible.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to enjoy your reInvent presentation and your talk. It was really great. And but absolutely, Tatum, I want to thank you for your time today. Your insights are invaluable. I think that the audience gets a lot out of this conversation, even just getting started, or if they're really mature in their FinOps deployments. There's a lot of things to consider here. I want to thank the audience for attending our session today. As I said, this is just a small bit of the information that you can learn about FinOps, CloudOps, and DevOps practices. And we'd love to hear more about, about this topic. So if you want to carry on the conversation, feel free to reach out to myself or Tatum, and we would be happy to carry on the conversation with you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.